All right, it looks like we've got a bunch of folks here, and I think it's time to get started. I'm sorry, we're a few minutes behind schedule. I'm Shannon Gilmore. I'm the Executive Director of Lincoln County Historical Association, and I'm so glad to welcome you all tonight. This is the third of our 2023 Winter Lecture Series, and it's been going really well so far. We're so glad to be offering this remotely because we have a wide audience. Many folks are attending live on the Zoom, and a lot of people have been registering so that they can receive the video link afterwards. And I've been recording these talks. We are recording this one, right? Yes. And you'll get an email within a few days afterwards of a link to watch this talk on YouTube. So let's see, I have just a couple of things I wanted to say before we get started. As I mentioned, this is a third in a series of lectures we're proudly offering this year. We've already had 2 incredibly popular talks, and those are available on YouTube. And next up, we will gather in person at Scadomfa Library next Thursday evening, March 2nd, 6 p.m. to hear from author Aimée Keithan. She will discuss her recent book, From Birmingham to the Battlefield. It traces the Civil War experiences of her great-great-grandfather, an early enlistee in the Union Army. I think it's going to be really interesting, and I hope you all can make it. It will be free, open to the public, and this time no advance registration required. So please just meet us at Scadomfa Library in Damariscotta next Thursday. Visit our website for more information. For a little bit of housekeeping, participants should remain muted throughout the talk, just because there are so many people on the Zoom. As questions arise, please put them in that chat box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. I'll read questions to Aimée at the end of the program when we will make time for a Q&A session. That's it for housekeeping. Now I'm happy to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Aimée Keithan. Many of you were with us when she spoke last week. We had a great talk last week, and she's back again, and I couldn't be happier to be introducing her for a second time. She's a buildings archaeologist and architectural historian. She's held research fellowships at George Washington's Mount Vernon and the Preservation Society of Newport County in Rhode Island. She currently works at Pejepska History Center as the Museum Services Manager. Dr. Keithan's research focuses on using the material culture of architecture to reveal the history of marginalized populations. You can find her, oops, I just lost you for a second. Oh, you're back. You can find her next spring as a speaker at the 2023 Vernacular Architecture Forum Annual Conference. She's currently also working on a book based on her dissertation, if that weren't enough. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Keithan back to our virtual stage. We're so happy to have her. And I will stop my screen share so that you can take over, Aimée.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.
I am going to do this slideshow with my camera off so that you can focus on the slideshow. So hopefully you can all see that. So thank you again for joining me, some of you for the second week in a row. I'm very grateful to Shannon for asking me back to speak again. And once again, I'd really like to thank James Tanzer, Corinne Tanzer, and Shannon for assisting me with my research and giving me access to the primary source material and buildings that I need to complete this work. I am presenting to you tonight from unceded Abenaki and Wabanaki lands, and this seems especially important since, as a colleague reminded me today, my workplace, the Pejepska History Center in Brunswick, Maine, includes an Indigenous place name, believed to refer to the rocky, winding nature of the nearby Androscoggin River, the lifeblood and livelihood of Native peoples for millennia before colonizers forcibly interrupted their way of life. It's important to realize that these issues are not relegated to the past. This season, Maine legislators are considering many initiatives related to the Wabanaki. I encourage you to learn more about these issues by visiting wabanakialliance.com. So tonight we are talking about architecture. Last week, we talked a lot about the individual people. We started from that aspect of things. And tonight we're going to take a look at the spaces and environments that surrounded them when they were imprisoned. We're going to start by looking at some of the earliest buildings of justice. Architecture of justice is what I'm calling it, in Lincoln County. And we're going to go all the way through and actually end with the Wiscasset Old Jail, which was the topic of our talk last week. So, excuse me, my throat's really dry tonight, so I apologize for that. So last week we touched upon how the physical environment of the jail, the Wiscasset jail, might have impacted prisoners' time there. And you might remember James Peters, a young Black boy who died from pneumonia while in jail. We theoretically put him in the least comfortable cell, which was partially underground. It faced the northeast, had a small window, and the cell was made entirely of large granite blocks. And it was really easy to see how such conditions might have led to death. This made me want to step back and examine the broader trends in architecture of prisons and jails and courthouses. I wanted to know whether or not the old Wiscasset jail was typical. When it was built in 1811, it was lauded for many architectural innovations. And if this was the height of 19th century prison architecture, what were the conditions like for people incarcerated in earlier structures? And likewise, when the jail went out of use a century later after its construction, what did accused criminals in the early 20th century experience? So we're going to look at a few examples tonight and talk about these. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is just mention what the elements of architectural design are. Normally, as an architect, you would be considering these elements when you're designing. And if you're designing for someone's home, you would want to consider the positive aspects of these things. We're not going to go through all of these individually, but I just want you to be aware that these are all of the types of things that people who are designing spaces actively consider when thinking about the users of spaces. Some of the most important for the architecture that we're going to be talking about tonight is site orientation. This is important because Maine is very cold, and if you have a building that faces north, that can obviously make a big difference. We know this time of year that we like our nice southern facing windows. Likewise, light and shadow is really important. A room with a lot of darkness and not very many openings and windows can really bring our mood down. And another thing that's quite important is it's listed as volumes and forms here. And that's basically how the space is shaped around a human. And this is something I want you to pay attention to as we go through these spaces as well. So first, we're going to take a look at the first Lincoln County jails. And I say jails because we think that there were two buildings. And these were on the ground of what was originally Fort Frankfurt, and then was later changed to Fort Shirley in Dresden. It was originally built in 1752 and went out of use by 1795. The facilities that we're going to talk about are the Eastern Blockhouse and the official county jail. In this rough site map of what we think it looked like, these are the buildings I want you to consider. The Eastern Blockhouse, which belonged to the Plymouth Company, was already existing in around 1861 when the county started thinking seriously about jail here. And that's because Lincoln County was essentially founded in 1761. The Plymouth Company was also called the Kennebec Proprietors, and they were essentially a group of colonizers who just decided that this was going to be their land, and the land was their asset, and they made money by selling off or renting parts of the land, and basically had control over the entire thing. So this had a fort in it as part of both trade and also defense. It, as you can see from the top there, it ran right along the edge of the Kennebec River, which was nice and deep for ships coming in and around, so they could control that as well. So the eastern blockhouse was part of that original fort. The bit that you can see in green here is the new county jail. And this was built in 1761, at that time that Lincoln County became a county itself. And this was purpose-built as a jail. It had you can see in blue there, a small yard. That was the original jail yard. And then the jail yard actually got expanded in 1766 in order to basically accommodate debtors. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the other thing I'd like you to look at here before we go into the buildings in detail is the courthouse. I want you to be aware of where the courthouse is in relation. And the other thing you might want to look at is where north is. That's the right-hand dotted line of the jail yard. So what were these buildings like? Well, the Eastern Blockhouse was probably very similar to the Fort Western Blockhouse that is in Augusta. That blockhouse and that fort was actually also built by the Kennebec proprietors. So it's pretty reasonable to assume that it had a very similar layout. And as you can see from the photo there are not very many windows. There aren't very many doors. The whole purpose of the blockhouse was to defend the exterior of the fort. So, of course, it makes perfect sense from a security standpoint to hold prisoners there temporarily. It wasn't built for prisoners, though. So in 1761, it's a long word, hold on, the Court of General Sessions of the Peace, they voted to build a new court, or a new jail at the same facility, but they wanted it to be specifically on the northerly side of the northwesterly flank of Fort Frankfort. And this was going to be specifically a jail for the county of Lincoln. So the blockhouse was used basically at the will of the Kennebec proprietors, but this new purpose-built jail was specifically for the county. It was 36 feet by 16 feet, probably about 7 feet high, but there were 2 floors. And just to give you an idea of the construction, it was timber. It was made from 12-inch thick hemlock. And the chimney wasn't actually built until the year after. So even though there were probably prisoners there in the winter of 1761, they didn't have fireplaces or stoves for that matter, for that one winter. So that would have been pretty miserable. The interior walls were made of oak boards, which would have been more secure than lath and plaster. So that was another security aspect. And there was a small yard, as you saw in the last slide. So what I want you to think about when you look at this is just how miserable the space was. And what I've put there for you is a photograph that shows the interior of the old Barnstable Jail. And this was a colonial jail that's in Barnstable, Massachusetts. It was built around 1690. And it's the oldest wooden jail in the United States, actually. It was built, the interior was built very similar to how the description of the new jail at Fort Shirley was. So I think when you look at that photo, you can get an idea of what it was like inside. And then in 1766, there were more debtors that were starting to be arrested. Last week, we just touched on debtors, and I told you that they were kind of a different class of prisoners, and this was indeed the case. Debtors weren't considered dangerous. They were actually in records referred to as debtors as opposed to criminals. So sentences that are passages that mention both will mention debtors and criminals. So they weren't seen as dangerous. As a result, they were given something called the liberty of the yard. And this was essentially area outside that they could walk around, not just for exercise, but to actually live their lives. They didn't have to be confined in jail. It was just that they were kept from their homes, essentially, until their debt was paid or taken care of. So what they did in 1766 was to expand that wall. It was actually fenced in for people who were mostly debtors to have that liberty of the yard. And it was nearly 3/4 of an acre. And it goes right down to the river, but they wouldn't have been able to get into the river. So that wouldn't have been a viable way of escape, even if they wanted to. But this would have been a real luxury that debtors would have had that other quote unquote criminals would not have had, and probably would have made their own experiences within the jail much more confining. The one other thing that I want to mention before we move on to the next building is that at this time, the jail's primary purpose within the law, within the justice system, was for pre-trial and pre-sentence. It was essentially a holding cell or a holding place, as well as debtors being able to serve out their time. So because most of the people that were arrested at this point were very poor and looked down upon by society, bail wasn't really denied ever, because most of the people that could pay the bail were considered more upstanding members of society and therefore not as dangerous. So last week we talked a little bit about prejudices against the poor, and this is another example of that happening quite early. But in general, being imprisoned wasn't the punishment itself. So in that first drawing that we had, we saw the Pownalborough Courthouse. It was a big purple square, and it was quite close to both of the jail buildings. This really beautiful building, which I encourage you to visit because it is still there. It's a Lincoln County historical building, and it's absolutely beautiful. It was designed by a Boston architect who was connected to the Kennebec proprietors. It was built in 1761 and used throughout the 18th century. And at the time that it was built, it was actually the tallest structure in English-speaking North America east of Portsmouth. So it was really impressive. And if you look at the website, there are definitely famous people that came here, but we're not going to focus on the famous people because we really want to know what the experience of other people are. And so in order to understand that, we're going to look at this building a little bit. So as you can see, it's a 3-story building. And on the second story, you can see here, half of the building was given up to the courtroom. And that's a pretty large space. And this originally was set up very much like the British courtrooms are even today. I think in American courtrooms, we're a lot more used to standing in front of the judge. In older courts and in Britain, you tend to stand perpendicular to the judge and you're sort of facing your accuser. And that was a little bit more how this was. And there was, of course, space for the jury and space for sort of the peanut gallery. Because in a way, oftentimes these criminal trials were actually seen as entertainment. So if you look at the floor plan on the right-hand side, one of the things you might notice is that the staircase is lined up directly to the middle of that courtroom. So the view that you see on the left is exactly what you would see if you entered the courtroom. It was meant to be serious, and it was meant to make you feel small and unimportant, and therefore to maximize the perceived power of the judges and magistrates that were at the front of the room. Another thing that you'll notice is the windows behind the judges. Depending on the day, that is, let's see, that is west. So depending on the time of day and the day, the light would have been quite bright from those windows, especially because you're coming up the stairs from a darker space. So you would have walked into this room, been a bit blinded by the light, and basically see the silhouettes of these very important, powerful men at the front of the room. Just those really small details would have made a huge difference to how it felt to be in that room for people who were accused of a crime. So again, we've got things like entrance to a space. That was a design principle. We've got things like light. We've got things like the scale of the room. All of those are going to impact the psychology of the people who are experiencing them. And if we just flip that for a second, and you think about the people at the front of the room with the power, you can see that they are all at a table on a small raised dais, and they therefore were literally above everyone else in the room. They would have felt that power, and the people they were judging would have felt that power. And the reason that I'm talking about this after the jails that we just talked about is because I mentioned that the jails were more holding cells and pre-trial rather than the punishments itself. So the prisoners and the accused would have essentially gone from the jail just across the way within the courthouse. And after 1766, they wouldn't have even had to leave the jail yard. They still would have been enclosed within that. So basically, all in one, very secure, and you wouldn't have had to worry about anything until you were actually sentenced. And then your sentence would have been carried out elsewhere, likely not imprisonment itself. The second Lincoln County Jail was built in 1795 when the jail that we were just talking about fell into disuse and was not in very great condition. This one was at the corner of what is currently Churchill and Washington Streets, right in Wiscasset. So you've got a little bit of a change there in that this is slightly more urban, if you will, because at the time that the first jail was built, it was very early, and the Kennebec proprietors were the ones that were actually building up the area. By the time this one is built in 1795, the area has already started having villages and clusters of communities, and Wiscasset was emerging as one of the more important ones. And so that's why they chose to have it there. It's at a crossroads, as you can see. It included both a jail and an attached jailer's house. Previously, there was facilities for the jailer in an attached, a barrack that was part of the original fort. And then when this was built, it was built as the official Lincoln County Jail. We don't exactly know what it looked like because it no longer exists, but we do have a really good description of what it looked like. It was 40 feet by 20 feet, had 2 floors that were 7.5 feet high. It was also made of timber, and it sounds very similar to the first purpose-built jail at Fort Shirley. It had those same heavy timbers and that sort of thing that were specified by the builders. And you can see the original 1793 plan along with the notes that were submitted to the committee that was going to build this. And like the first jail, this one also had a yard enlargement. There was a petition, and it specifically said that the prisoners confined to the jail yard are subject to many and great inconveniences by reason of the confined limits thereof. And one of the things that they were especially worried about is that within the original limits of the yard, there were no other farms or farmhouses, which meant that the prisoner, and in most cases, they're talking about debtors here, the prisoner was either, quote, compelled to victual with the jailer or at Wiscasset at a much dearer rate than could be supplied by a farmer. So prisoners were responsible for paying for their own meals, especially if they didn't want what the jailer was providing. So if there wasn't a farmhouse or a farm within that large jail yard, then they had to either go downtown Wiscasset, which I believe was in the jail yard at that time, and basically eat at an expensive restaurant, not great for debtors, or they would have had to have whatever the jailer was providing. So as a result of that, they actually increased the yard to 2.5 miles by 1.25 miles. And then eventually it was actually expanded to include the entire town. So again, you have to remember that debtors weren't considered a flight risk, and their punishment was really not being able to be home and not being able to live their lives in freedom. So that still would have not felt good for them. This jail had an attached jailer's house. And if you look at the plan there, you can see that it was nearly as big as the actual jail itself. It was 36 by 16, I think, as opposed to 40 by 18. But what I want you to do is notice there that the jailer's house has a nice big chimney block right in the center that's shown. There is no corresponding chimney block in the jail portion. There are just 2 rooms on either side of a staircase, and then there would have been 2 rooms in the upstairs as well. This ended up being a little bit of a problem because by 1799, this is like 4 years after it was built, the jailer said that he had to put 5 to 6 prisoners in each room, which also meant that the debtors had to be put with the so-called criminals, and they couldn't have a room for themselves. So the solution that the jailer came up with was to order to share some of and then all of the spaces in the jailer's house with the debtors. And then that eventually forced an addition to the jailer's house. And if we look at this building in terms of security, things were getting a little bit rowdier in the area as the population was growing, as civilization was settling down, as the law became more entrenched in society. So in April 1st, 1797, at 2:00 in the morning, there was actually quite a riot. 200 to 300 armed people gathered, and about 40 to 50 of those people forced their way into the jail by threatening the jailer, all in order to release a particular group of 3 people who they thought didn't get due process and shouldn't have been imprisoned. And this obviously was a bit of an issue, Number one, because they were actually able to break into the jail and break these people out, but also because even though the local constabulary heard that this was going to happen, they realized that it was so big that it wouldn't have been any use at all to send out a police presence. So they just didn't do that. And then in 1803, another 5 prisoners escaped. And at that point, they said, enough is enough. We need a fence. They didn't even have a fence at this time. So they actually built a really secure fence that included 12 by 12-inch sills, 8-inch posts, cross sills every 12 to 14 inches, and lots of other bracing, as well as a timber-driven piles into a 15-inch deep trench. And then all of that was covered with hemlock boards. So that wasn't going anywhere. And that's how they dealt with security. And you can probably understand, if you were a person in that jail, you would have been in quite crowded conditions, and you would have felt quite confined. And then they add this incredibly stalwart fence that's going to make you feel even more separated from anyone in the town and make you essentially feel worse about your condition. So in the process of adding more security, what they're doing to the psychology of the people within this jail is they're making them feel worse about themselves. There's this sort of moralistic portion to this. But in 1806, which is only 11 years after the jail was built, the jail was seen as unsafe, mostly because despite the fence, there were security risks. They had ordered large padlocks. That wasn't doing enough. And then the other thing that was a real issue that the jailer mentioned particularly was that waste removal for all of these prisoners wasn't up to snuff. It wasn't keeping up with the large number of people within the jail. The waste removal system was designed for a certain number of prisoners within those spaces, but obviously it was incredibly crowded, overcrowded. And so it was actually filthy. And so add to that, again, the experience of the people within the jail: crowded, filthy, can't get clean, feeling oppressed. These are the changes that would have impacted the people within the spaces. We're not going to go really in depth with this, but I did want to mention that after the Pownalborough Courthouse, there was a second courthouse that was in Wiscasset, and it's really only a few blocks. It's less than a mile away from that jail we just talked about. It's actually on 21 High Street, and it's currently the town library. And it faces west. It's made of brick. It's located on lovely grounds in Wiscasset, and it's just a very simple building, but it is built of brick. And this would have given it a sort of gravitas that maybe the Pownalborough Courthouse wouldn't have had at the time. It was built in 1803 to 1805. And so this would have corresponded with prisoners who were being held at the jail that we just talked about. And finally, we're going to go back here to the Wiscasset Old Jail that we talked about last week, but look at it slightly differently. You can see it in the upper right-hand corner here, and it's shown with almost no windows at all. Obviously, this is a bird's eye view. It's just a drawing, so it's not super accurate, but you could tell that that's the jail because it's not house-like. It's distinctly not welcoming and residential looking. Now, this is a little bit out of town on Federal Street, but it's still fairly close to the town. It also had an attached jailer's house, like the jail we just talked about. But the big change and the big advancement with this jail was that it had individual cells. So by 1811, which was fairly early, this building had individual cells. And you can see as well that it was made of granite. And this was a huge improvement for security over the buildings that we've talked about in the past. And part of this is because of the stability that was starting to happen in the area, but also just to meet that need for security. As we talked about last week, the jailer's house that you see there, which is brick, was actually added in 1839 because the one that was there before, which was made of timber, burnt down. But that also adds a sense of imposing nature to the building. So if we look at the floor plans, like we did last week, but we're going to look at them in a little bit more detail, and we're going to consider the things that we talked about and looked at in the other buildings. So if we look at the aspect of this building, north is at the top here. And the ground floor of this 3-story building made of granite is sunk into the ground. On the second floor, there is very little light. None of the rooms have a lot of light, but as you can see in this floor plan, on the second floor, they're just very tiny slits. So that would have impacted how you felt. The other thing that this has that would have felt distinctly institutional is a central corridor with rooms on either side. So even though people could have their individual cells, there was this feeling of sameness. You're the same as everybody else in there. Your individuality doesn't matter. Each of the cells had huge iron doors that you can see on the left. And if you were lucky, so the story goes, you could sit outside on that bench while being manacled just to get some quote unquote fresh air. So last week I showed you this drawing where I looked at the most secure space. This is on the second floor. And along with having the very small windows, it also has 3 walls of the 4 walls in the room are interior walls. So you actually couldn't break out of there. So we were talking about security last week, but I want you to consider this time what it must have felt like to be in that most secure space. It wouldn't have been most secure as in I feel safe. It would have been most secure as in trapped, no way out. And you would definitely have felt that, especially because both the ceiling and the floor are granite in those spaces. And to contrast that, we can look at from the perspective of someone who would be in these spaces, what would have made a space comfortable. And in this building, the top floor has some walls that are actually made out of wood. The interior walls in these spaces are timber. The doors are also timber on this floor. And remember how we were talking about the debtors a bit earlier? The debtors were meant to be housed in this upper floor originally. So the spaces that they had were much nicer to begin with. The windows were much larger, so you get more light. And the one that I've highlighted as the most comfortable faces southwest. So that would have had nice light all day long. The ceilings in these spaces were also much taller. And you had, this is kind of a tiny thing, but you would have had really nice views from the top. So just overall, it's a much lighter, brighter, comfortable space than you have in those lower 2 floors in the basement and those spaces. And so that would have been actually one of the privileges of being a debtor. And then I also wanted to mention just tangentially that at this time, around 1824, the Lincoln County Courthouse that we know today was built. And I just wanted to show you this because I've got a picture there of the courtroom itself. And you see that just like the jail that we just looked at, where things are becoming more institutional and more regular, the courthouse itself was as well. The scale of this is a lot bigger. And you have that sense, again, just like you did in the Pownalborough Courthouse, but magnified, of everything facing the people with the power. And you would have felt quite small when you walked in there. And that was deliberate. That was very deliberate. And this, I believe, is the oldest courthouse in Maine that's still in use. So apparently we still like that feeling of littleness. It's still an important part of law enforcement today. So I want to kind of wrap this up by introducing you to a person. And I've chosen this person because his life and experiences spanned many of the buildings that we talked about. Peter Bobo was also called Africa Peter. He shows up in quite a few records. He was a Black man who lived in the town of Waldoboro. There was a legend that he had been an African prince, and because of that, he had a bad attitude. And who knows whether that is true or not. I kind of feel like that is a trope that ended up happening quite a bit in order to diminish the sense of pride and individualism that Black people at the time had. He actually got himself in quite a bit of trouble. Part of the trouble that he got himself into included a man named Goodwin. Goodwin was actually, I believe, the jailer, Samuel Goodwin, the jailer of that old jail. And a 1796 arrest warrant he said that he was charged with assaulting Samuel Goodwin Jr. with the intent to murder. So that was pretty serious. He probably would have been held at the Fort Shirley, jail. I don't know which one he would have been held at, but he would have been held there. But his actual trial was in Hollowell. There was a courthouse in Hollowell and a courthouse in Wiscasset at that time. So he was actually tried in Hollowell. So we know that he was in Pownalborough at that first jail. But then we can also put him in the second jail, because in July 9th of 1799, we find him in the records of the jail in Wiscasset for assault as well. But there is this other aspect to Peter Bobo's experiences, and that is his mental health, because he's referred to many times as being insane. And in fact, one of the issues with his assault on Samuel Goodwin was the fact that he was seen to sort of go insane. He just sort of went wild and had to be restrained. So unfortunately, I see this much more as a case of mental health and needing mental health services, rather than criminal behavior. Unfortunately, Peter also ends up showing up at what we call now the Wiscasset Old Jail, that last building, the big granite building. He is the first person that is recorded in the records of the Wiscasset jail. And it is noted that unfortunately he died in the jail, and he's listed as being insane. And so if you think about it, at the beginning of Peter's sentence, the jails were a place to hold people before their sentence was carried out. by the time Peter Bobo died, jails were being used much more as a punishment, especially since his death occurred before there were any quote unquote insane asylums in the state. So Peter really needed help, essentially, and he was put away. And just to bring this to the future, at the time, if you were Peter Bobo, bring this to the future of where prison architecture was going and where punishment was going. The picture that you see and the plan that you see is the Eastern State Penitentiary, which is one of the most infamous prisons in the United States. It was built shortly after the main state prison in Thomaston was built in 1820s. And at this time, you start getting prison architecture that was specifically designed around penal systems. And in this case, it was the radial system, and it was what was called the Pennsylvania system. There were two main systems. The Pennsylvania system was based on the idea that prisoners should be kept in isolation. And what you see here, you can see each of those radial arms has a little tiny individual yard attached to it. So each of those yards was attached to a cell, and everyone had their own cell, and depriving someone of human contact, along with all of the other architectural methods that were happening, was something that was also meant to dehumanize them. And it made it easier for the people who were running the jail, because you had that central tower there, which even if you couldn't see all the way down every single hallway, would definitely have given any prisoners in there the impression that that was happening. The other system I don't have a picture of was called the New York or the Auburn system. And these were much more in favor of work as the cure. And this obviously lived into the 20th century, where you have public works. I think it even exists today in some states, where it is supposed to be, good for recovery and reformation for prisoners to be working. What I want to point out with that is that is a direct result of poor societal thinking, that the reason that people commit crimes is because they're lazy and not working. And so the fact that this exists in our preconceptions today, and the stereotype exists, has to do with outdated 19th century thinking about what made people commit crimes. And that is all I have for you tonight. Thank you very much for watching. There's my contact information at the bottom. I could have included so many more buildings, but I hope I gave you a little bit of taster and helped you think slightly differently about any buildings that you would that you experience that have to do with justice.
Thanks, Aimée. That was really interesting. Thank you so much. We've got a lot of questions here, as usual. Everyone always has lots of follow-ups for you. But I want to say that I found that so interesting, and I would like to walk around all those buildings with you again someday and just look at them through your eyes, because you see so many things I don't see. A couple questions that came in kind of earlier on. You spoke several times about debtors, and there are a few questions about the debtors that I think we can kind of put together. How did they pay off their debt when they were imprisoned? And would it have been, common for them to have to pay for their meals in the era, or, where and when? There are like 3 or 4 different questions about that. If you have an opportunity to expound.
Sure. It's actually quite a complex and almost entirely different area of study than criminal prisoners. But essentially, if you owed someone money, there were a couple of ways that you could get out, but a lot of it had to do with your individual circumstances and the circumstances in which your debt occurred. So sometimes you could just kind of serve out your debt by serving time. people who didn't have a ready means of income could do that. That was their punishment. And essentially, I think what happened at that point was the town kind of pays your debt. And then the other way is that sometimes somebody else could purchase your debt, and then you would sort of owe them, and you could work out something with them. And then the other way, of course, would be that you can pay back the person or people that you owe. And that could be through things like side hustles you've got going, selling things, mortgaging things, all the ways we think of today as paying debt. But the whole sort of punishment, as it were, is that you weren't free to live your life as you normally would while you were under this heavy debt. And they were provided with the most basic food and from the jailer, just as the rest of the prisoners were. But because debtors were sort of white collar criminals, they expected better meals and were used to better meals. And so they had the option to pay for better meals. And so whether or not they had access to that ready access without breaking the laws of the liberty of the yard was really important to them.
And just to clarify, you had indicated that the debtors had the liberty of the yard meant that they could come and go more freely than other people who were held. Okay.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Here's a super easy question. I think it was the Eastern State Penitentiary you showed at the end. Somebody just asked where was that? I wanted to clarify, where is that located?
It's in Pennsylvania. Let's see. I'm going to find the exact town. I think it's just outside of Philly, actually. Let's see. I'm asking the Google. It's a museum now. It's and yes, it's in Philly. Actually, Al Capone was one of the prisoners that was there. So it's actually got a really famous history. I find it incredibly interesting for the architecture, but it actually has a really famous history because at the time it was a really secure prison. And so a lot of the more famous criminals were sent there.
Interesting. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. I'm sure you mentioned it too, but we just missed it the first time. One question concerns what you referred to as the most secure cells in the current, or not the current, but the jail that we currently steward in Wiscasset. The person who's asking, excuse me, my daughter is running laps around the house right now, and I'm going to just get her attention. Okay, I think she's done. I know there's like 45 people here waiting to see if she runs through again. I think she's not going to run through again. Okay, we're good. I'm so sorry. But anyway, the person who's asking that question is someone who's familiar with the jail. And she was wondering about why you specified that some of the cells were specifically the most secure cells, because she knows that some of the others also have 3 granite walls surrounding them. Do you understand that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So essentially, the reason that I chose those 2 rooms to be the most secure, as opposed to the rooms below, which would have had, it's not just 3 granite walls, but 3 interior granite walls. Sorry if I left that out, because that's kind of an important bit. And then the reason that the second floor is more secure than the first floor is because of the small windows. It was impossible for a human to fit out those windows. And if you managed to break the stone in between those 2 slits and still go out of them, then you would have had to drop an entire story to get to the ground. So because of those reasons, it would have been hard to get out. And if you did get out, it would have been really dangerous. So that's why those are the most secure, as opposed to some of the other spaces that have similar elements to them.
Okay, great. Which I would argue are also very secure, but just like
I would agree.
So slightly less so.
Yes.
Got it. Have you found any evidence that marginalized groups were held in more uncomfortable cells or places versus white counterparts?
I haven't found any direct evidence, but I will say that multiple people died, especially we have records for the last jail that we talked about. Multiple people died in there, a lot of them from something called lung fever, which was essentially pneumonia. And quite a number of people were people of color. It would be really interesting to do an actual statistical study to see if there were more of them. But I would say that it's much more likely that the people who were dying of lung fever were in the less comfortable cells, the ones that were damper and darker. And so I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that some of those marginalized groups were held in the least comfortable cells.
Interesting. Okay, that's quite a lot to think about, and it's interesting to me. It's interesting to look at the spaces in that way and see them in a different, their impact in a kind of different way, and think about that. I think that we're going to end our questions there, because most of the other questions, there was one other question that was different. Most of the other questions have overlapped, and we've kind of covered a lot of them. But the one other one was, you mentioned the current library in Wiscasset as a former courthouse, and the person asking the question asked if it was actually previously a bank also, because that's what she
it was. Absolutely.
And it was a courthouse before the bank, is that correct?
Yeah, it was built as a courthouse in 1803.
All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for all of these questions. Thank you, Aimée, for this really interesting presentation. I really always enjoy hearing from you. And so it's really a pleasure to bring you to our community and to share you with our network of folks. And to everyone who came tonight, thank you for joining us. I will send the recording of this talk out to everybody's email within a couple of days. And I hope to see you all again in coming weeks at our upcoming talks.
Thank you, everyone.
Again, this is everyone's chance to applaud, silent applause. Take care.